Good afternoon, folks. It's 12 noon. The gong has struck in Eastern Australia. I'm somewhere between Brisbane and Sydney on the east coast of the mainland. And I would just like to say welcome to the crew, wherever you may be around the country or the world, in fact. And I'll get to a bit of housekeeping in a second. And firstly, Gabrielle Chan, how are you?
Very well, very well.
Very
Lovely to be here, Bart.
well. I'm channeling Richard Feidler right at the moment, and I'm going to say that interviewing prolific writers has never been on my resume, so this will be a work in progress for all of us.
First for everything, every time.
Absolutely. So I'm Bart Davidson, as I said. I'm not Richard Feidler. My role is to link the data between the paddock, the livestock, people, and the environment within MaiaGrazing, not to mention a bunch of other things. I was one of the co-founders, and it's my delight to be involved in data and to therefore jump out of that world and into the world of why we should give a fig, if not a big F, about farming. So, Gabby, let me introduce you. Gabrielle Chan is the rural and regional editor of Guardian Australia. Her first book was Rusted Off, Why Country Australia is Fed Up. It was shortlisted for the 2019 Prime Minister's Literary Awards and the 2019 Walkley Book Prize. Her latest book, Why You Should Give a F About Farming, was released just recently in August 2021. So, lots to talk about, Gabby. My very first thought is that I'm struck by my memories of Michael Parkinson and how he never ever referred to notes when he was interviewing prolific thinkers, and that'll be my challenge for today. So before we jump in, let me just ask everybody on the call, on the webinar, on the Zoom, to please drop a note in the chat. Let us know where you are, where you're from, and to please throw out comments, questions, and we're certainly going to get to some Q&A before we wrap up, and make this as interactive as Gabby can entertain us with. So plenty to talk about, but please do throw those in the chat section, and we'll do our best to get through them. And I must remember, actually, we did, or someone had the bright idea of offering some prizes. In fact, three copies of Gabby's book, and I think we might kick off by just awarding those three, because I'll forget otherwise, Gabby. So it's a good segue into why this might matter. Do you want to kick off, Gabby, and let us know who you chose and why?
I've got Angie Solito, and she said the answer to the question of why you should give an F about farming is it's the only way to simultaneously feed a growing population and save the planet where we live. I would have added help save the planet where we live. I just think it's a great combination. Angie's got a great combination there between feeding the world and doing it in a very sustainable way. And the only reason I added help in there was because I think part of the challenge for farmers is changing their practices so that they are maybe reducing emissions and becoming more sustainable, because that's what the market's demanding. But farmers can't do all of it. Farmers can't do everything, and so it just slightly worries me when we hear this kind of enthusiasm for doing all the heavy lifting. Like, I think other sectors of the economy have to pull their weight as well, obviously, and they're sectors that create a much bigger footprint. And the other one was Brian Marshall. It has to consider people, land and profit simultaneously, and I like that idea of not just being one thing or the other, because a lot of the farming conversation often revolves around, should you be sustainable or should you be profitable? And obviously businesses have to do both.
Well chosen. And I must say, Brian Marshall does know that subject matter better than
I suspect he does. If it's the Brian Marshall, I think it is. Yes.
I have a strong suspicion it is. So well done, Brian. And my selection for that little prize goes to Mr. Charles Allen, for the simple reason that he reminded me of why I'm here. Charles' reason for was I eat, therefore I'm involved. I love it. It's simple. It's actually the net result of 3 or 4 years at university for me. That's the one thing that I remember most out of all of my travails running through soil science, agroecology, sustainability, forestry, the whole thing. I came away, and if someone asked me what I remember from uni, it was that if I eat, I'm involved. So a great segue into the book, in fact, because look, it's a big subject. It's let me start from scratch. So actually, I'll start by just giving a quote. And there were so many quotes, Gabby, that I've rewritten your book. Actually, I have. Number one, I made sure that I read the book so that I could actually try and keep up with you. And in the process, I actually wrote down a bunch of things that I just found really compelling and really resonated. And I'll start with one in a minute. But I must say that off the bat, that is one of the greatest takeaways I've got from reading the book, in that I thought, here we go, another numpty attempt at trying to, understand the farmer, trying to understand the consumer in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, LA, wherever, and try and thread that with a bit of language that sells a few books. But you know what? You didn't do that. You actually took on a really tough challenge, and you have, I think, succeeded in threading some very complicated, interdependent subjects, which, again, after my 20 odd years in this space, I still can't articulate clearly because of their complexity. And yet you just threaded them, you smashed it. You put a line of thought through those interwoven aspects that is very accessible to numpty Joe Blow, who really just wants to talk about drinking beer and what's on the footy, and then all the way through to the academic. That in itself is a great challenge. And I'll open up my first grab here that I thought encapsulated things quite well. It's great. I think it was early in the book. This book is a response to the contradictory policies around food growing. Here are some messages from governments and eaters to farmers. We want clean, green food to feed the world. We want scale because we want cheap food. We want family farmers. We want the mums and dads. We want big global capital. We want lots to export to help our balance of payments. GDP matters, although that wasn't in a quote, but we want farmers to stand on their own 2 feet. We want to pay no subsidies. We want farming to be like any other business. We want farmers to use the latest technology. We want them to look after the environment. We want farmers to look after native habitat from declining species. And now we want them to sequester carbon to turn around both their own emissions and some of the rest of the population's emissions as well. And I think that just about covers it. It's a good start. Thank you for that. Where would you like to start, Gabby? This is your book. This is your thesis. Where would you like to start?
I guess I'd like to start on why I chose to write about this, because I think it explains the ambitious project that I took on. I thought I've been living on a farm for the last 25 years, and I've been writing about politics. And so I was increasingly hearing these conversations in the political realm in Parliament House in Canberra about all of those expectations that you just read out. And I thought, how is this going to work? We've got this system that really demands all these extra things of farmers, and we have no way of threading the needle, either in a government sense, government policy sense, or in a business sense. And so I wanted to just pull the thread of the farm and see where it took me. And for those who haven't read the book, it's essentially a journey for me, learning about what it is. What is this business of farming, and where does it take you? And I thought it would be quite a simple exercise, because in the public's mind, farming is seen as a very simple exercise. You just grow food, you get it off, get it to market, end of story. But as I know, from being part of a farm business, it's so much more complex than that. And so I wanted to pull that thread of the farm and describe its complexity. But what I wasn't prepared for is how that led me to the kind of basic philosophical questions that humans have been asking themselves from Aristotle's time. It's like how we interact with nature, how we consider government intervention or not, how the economy affects farming, how the climate affects farming, the people equation in farming. And I quickly discovered that farming is really exposed to these really key existential problems that are facing the world. So most of the political debates that I was reporting on, farming is exposed to. So climate change is obviously the big one, but in my political reporting, I was reporting on areas that were really being challenged by, say, water management, or natural disasters, or they were being cut off in floods to, work out how to distribute food. All of these things, pretty much every subject for me comes back to farming and how that affects that. So I wanted to encapsulate that in a book, and I quickly found myself, terrified that I had bitten off more than I could chew. But I hope the end product, which is a series of chapters on particular subjects, has that line of narrative through it that can explain this whole farming caper and how interconnected it is with every other part of society.
Well, I think you have done that, and I think that is certainly, there's a big risk in trying to take on all of those elements and not thread them together, or half do it, or find that you get shot down because you couldn't go deeply enough into the domain of some pretty high level expertise, on the economic side or the ecological side or the social side. And that's, I guess it was probably the journo in you that made sure you asked the probing questions to feel comfortable, because I get the sense that you needed the deeper answers. You didn't want the superficial, and you just don't put up with the superficial. Is that fair?
No. And, so an example of that, I guess, is we are mid-sized mixed farmers. And when I say we, I use the royal we, because it's really the farmer, who I don't name in the book, the farmer who does the farming business. I'm a writer and a journalist, and I have my own, I have a job separately. But so I come to it, though, with a certain perspective. I came to the book with a mid-sized farming family perspective, with all the subjectivity that allows. I think I was pretty skeptical of corporate farming. I had seen a particular, the economic debate that has happened in Australia and around the world really since the 80s. And so I was quite skeptical about what the advantages, disadvantages of that were. But so from a family background, I really wanted to interview corporates as well. So that's an example of where, the journo in me can't just write the polemic and smash it out on the typewriter and say, well, family farmers are the best, that the end. You have to go to all of these different voices. And I think the nuance of this subject means that, it would be a far less interesting product as a book if you didn't do that. If it was the same old kind of narrative that we've seen in farming in the past.
Agreed. So who did you write it for?
I wrote it for both the farming sector, and also eaters, i.e. everyone. So, I guess I envisaged that maybe if I was lucky, a portion of ag would read it, because I recognise there would be some scepticism about a journo coming in and writing about farming. But I also really wanted the portion of metropolitan people who maybe might be interested in food, or might be interested in economics, who might be interested in climate change, that would pick it up and have it come away with a better understanding of the complexities of farming. Because the other thing I was hearing in the political debate was like, you know, farmers should just say, stop growing livestock. You know, that whole livestock issue was a very kind of simple thing. If you want to fix climate change, just get rid of your cattle and sheep, and that'll fix it. You know, I wanted to bring that complexity into it.
Based on the emissions and the different parts of the equation. Sure. Okay, so again, a pretty ambitious target there, and we will step through. You know, it's a wide-ranging book, and we'll step through some of the detail. Folks don't think we're going to not do that. I'm interested in having gone through the detail, and from my own perspective as someone who's studied ecology and worked on farms, been a farmer, worked in data, worked in software. What is it that you wish you hadn't learned in writing this book? Because I've got a great one. Tell me, what did you wish you hadn't learned? Because you've done a lot of research.
That is a bloody good question. You should be a journalist.
Failed. Couldn't do it.
I think it would be around the corporate farming thing, because, you know, I'm of the view that some of the landscape changes that are required will need other income sources, right? So you can't, as a farmer, if you need to say have a carbon neutral footprint, if you need to tick the boxes when you're going to export your canola to Europe and say, you know, you've got 5% of pollinators, or whatever the rules are that countries decide about what they import, then that's going to require management changes on farm, right? And the scale issue for me, as someone that lives in a town of lives near a town of 2,000 people, the scale issue for me has always butted up against that the capacity for rural communities to stay vibrant and stay relatively populated and maintain a kind of diversity, right? So on the one hand, you've got multiple small to medium businesses around a rural town is going to create more population than a very big farm at scale. It's just the way efficiency works, right? You don't need as many staff, you don't have as many families, you don't have as much population in the town. But when you look at the environmental requirements and the way the world is moving, scale is actually one of the things that can provide very good outcomes, alternatively very bad outcomes if it's done badly. And so that scale part of farming is going to be a big, I think, a big thing going forward. And so from learning that, I had to really rethink the way I thought about farming. And in the end, I landed on a place where, you know, we've got to have a diversity. We can't have, you know, all big farms. We can't have all small to medium family farms. There's got to be some diversity, and maybe that corporate sector can find out things that can help those small to mediums, so that we still do have those thriving rural communities.
Sure, and I guess that you know, you'd certainly explore that quite deeply, and at the end of the day, it's a microcosm of the broader problem in, you know, maintaining vibrant communities, having accountability, having reporting structures and disciplines that the corporate has that are a great outcome for any business. And some of those examples that you stepped through with the actual people doing the actual work out in farmland around Australia were great examples of that, in that they managed like a corporate but were a family farm, and should they never sell, we're all the better for it.
Mhm.
Very good examples of that, but it ultimately encapsulates the tension that we're all watching between change in management requirements, change in obligation, change in accountability, change in processes, change in markets, that the corporates in some ways really, well, the corporate model is far better equipped to deal with than the family farm, but we can't have it. There's no binary here. There's no black or white. And I guess that's your finding. I'll tell you what I wish I hadn't learned, and it's facetious, but it actually pulled me up. The world's tallest tree had to be cut down.
Oh no! Sorry.
To work out how tall it was. So here we are trying to understand agriculture and the role of eaters, as you put it, and the farmer and everything in between. And I was struck how crazy a world we live in when we actually have to kill the thing that we love to understand what it measures. So a tiny intangible on the side there, but that did strike me. So you wrote this book very much in the Australian context. You know, it's got that Australian tone and that Australian character running through it. To what extent do you think this applies globally?
I think the issues that I attempt to grapple with apply globally. I think the difference in Australia, and I think I wrote about it, was just the scale that we have. You know, I interviewed James Rebanks, who's written his own books, and just talking to him, we had so many sort of mutual interests, and yet he's on a farm in what he calls his Crooked Fells in the UK, and it's 200 and something acres, and you would, at first glance, you would say, oh, well, nothing that relates to him could relate to people who are on thousands and thousands of acres, and yet there are similarities. So I think definitely every other country has the food dilemma of, you know, on the one hand, you're trying to push the price down to cheapest possible price in order to allow the most possible people to afford to eat. And on the other, you're saying, well, you know, the cost of production can only go so far down. So that would be a conversation, that an issue that's relevant to no matter where you are, whether you're in countries like Australia and the US, where people spend a relatively tiny proportion of their pay packets on food, or whether it's in any other country that spends a higher proportion. So environmental services, you know, the bringing together of agriculture and eco or environmental services is starting to happen everywhere. So that's another issue that, you know, all of these things, soil, you know, my chapters, soil, water management, all of these things I think are relevant, though, you know, maybe if you're coming from another country as a reader, you might find some of the things about the political issues a little bit confusing. I think the basic elements of the arguments are really, really foundational arguments that all countries, all human societies have been grappling with for a long time.
Certainly. And I think that Australia may be just a better microcosm or a better exaggeration of some of the strains as the lucky country where we've been digging stuff up and we've been riding the sheep's back and we've been learning how to manage intensive to extensive grazing lands. I think it's probably just a good exaggeration of the problems that everybody else is facing. Absolutely. And you've reminded me that really and we will get into those chapters forthrightly as a way of stepping into that. One of the other things that struck me was that when I don't know what I don't know, and I really don't know where to begin, I try and find someone that knows a lot more than me. And you've done that by, there's some amazing people that you've interviewed here, from Ken Henry, the quiet Secretary to the Treasury, a whole bunch of farmers that I won't rattle off, but some of them I know personally, and some very innovative and boisterous characters, through to Oral Maguire, that incredible leader of of the Indigenous in WA, through to the mighty Major General Michael Jeffries, God rest his soul, federal ministers who my father will kill me for forgetting. Garno, I can't recall if you actually interviewed him, but extensive review, Stephen Lacey, Stephen Bartos, it goes on and on. So you've really confronted the people in the box seat to do with all the aspects that go to this great conundrum that you've investigated around how we eat. And I'll start there by just saying, okay, what is the problem, as I read it, that you are confronting here? And it's big, it's hairy, it's difficult, it's challenging, but ultimately the problem that, if I was to sum it up in my least articulate way, I think the problem is that you're trying to gain a common understanding and a common sense of purpose around how we as humans produce, eat, and relate to the Mother Earth that we've got. That's a big subject, and it's too broad. But essentially, you've tried to pull all of those different threads of ecology, community, policy, natural capital, water, as you say, soil, all the way through to the agronomics. That's a big, hairy problem to solve. So you began the book by saying you wrote the book because you thought that Australians and their governments are not clear on what to expect from farming. That was where you started. And I get the feeling that it's a whole lot bigger than that. Let's go through those chapters, or at least some of them. But in a nutshell, that's where you began. You didn't see that Australians and their governments had a clear expectation of the farm. Where are you with that now?
I think it's still true. I think there are, sorry for people outside Australia, but I think there are bits of optimism that I'm seeing in a policy sense around some programs, some of them pilots from the federal government, from the Agriculture Minister David Littleproud, around environmental services and income streams for things like biodiversity. Mm-hmm. I think the private sector is moving probably a lot faster than the public sector. So I think that's going to be interesting to see. Just this morning on the news, I heard the Commonwealth Bank talking about discounted loans for environmental works to make farming more sustainable. Now, that doesn't mean much in a low interest rate environment, but obviously if interest rates rise, which I'm sure they will at some stage, that might mean a bit more than it currently means at very low interest rates.
Sure.
So there are, and there's just the energy of farmers that I'm seeing around really looking hard at their systems, getting data the way your business provides, finding ways to, I guess, make the business more sustainable and more resilient in the face of very changing climatic conditions, but also political conditions. The trade changes that we're going to see, I think, are going to be really big as we've just come through the COP26, the climate talks. So all of these things, I think, we're all inventing the wheel at the same time, right? Yep. Even though it's a reinvention, farmers constantly deal with changing conditions, and so I guess the key to me was working out, what are the things that can help create the best businesses that farmers can have, and I hope that the government will use some of this to work out a way that will be possible, because it can't all be in the private sector. It can't all be in government. It's not going to be one or the other. It's going to be a mix of both. And that's the interesting thing to me around this policy space.
Okay, so we're not going to be able to go through every chapter, and nor should we, because we want people to go and read the book, right, and get that deeper sense of this wonderful topic. it's not just a wonderful topic, it's an essential topic, right? This is critical. This isn't like worrying about whether we can go to Mars with Elon, or whether we can finesse the next iteration of an electric vehicle, or what. This is about how we eat. This is about how we survive. This is about how we interact with the world that we live in, and the farm is ultimately the microcosm of that, and the window for everybody else into our fragility ultimately. And a couple of things stand out here. So when we eat not just the food, but the farming system that grew the food. What a cracker. The food has become the product. That shook me a little bit, because I see that in a bunch of people around me, and worry about the energy that's flowing into food and food tribalism now. And my last little grab here was, if farmers can't stand behind the virtue of their product, they will fall behind. I'm forced to agree with all of these so far. And I guess these are all things that I'm saying because I want the crew on the call to realise that there's a lot of depth and detail in Gabby's book, and we can obviously only go into each of those so far, but the thread really is exposing the risk. We've been through this, so exposing the risk, let's talk about that in a second. The culture, the relationship that the farm has to the eaters, as you so beautifully put, all of us ultimately, but certainly those that are outside the farm gate. And how that then flows on into the food tribes and this entire world, as we've spoken about before, that is becoming so tribal in every essence. Whether we in MaiaGrazing are talking to a certain tribe of graziers in how they have, in their language, and how they interact with the livestock, the paddocks, the sun, the moon, and everything that we deal with, all the way through to tribalism in the type of food that I'm going to eat, or that my daughters now say that they must buy. So let me just step back from that. As I was saying, the risk. So it's kind of like the perfect timing for your book, because we were all cruising along, and we then walked into a monstrous drought. We had some incredibly dry times where people were saying that never, in the entirety of white man time, never has it been so dry. Everywhere I was going, that was the story I was getting. I was on the phone with grown men crying because of the mistakes that they realised they had made in how they managed their land. That was my memory of 2019. Mm. You walk through these kind of stories and the problem, but then you take that back to the supply chain, and that we have this set of bottlenecks and the wine glass, as you describe, in terms of the problem between the eaters and the producers, that really blew up when we had flood, and then we had fires, and then we had someone eat a bat in China, and then we've had flood, and then everything's still kind of moving along, and we're back into La Nina probably at the moment. So there's this converging set of atypical vectors that just say, there's a whole bunch of risk on the table as a food consuming species, and as a dominant species in the environment, that we are kind of just realizing you can't escape from on risk. So do you, when you think back on that last couple of years, was that a main driver of you coming at the book? Would you have written the book without that 3 years of absolute crazy confluence?
Well, I started the book before the pandemic. So I started, I'd talked to my publisher before the pandemic started, and I started researching in 2019. And I really, it came out of the 2019 election where I'd reported on a couple of rural electorates that had really been shaken up by water management. And I wanted to look at the whole thing. And so I talked to my publisher, and then of course we hit January 2020 and the pandemic starts, and I'm seeing a live experiment before my very eyes of supply chain risk. So by March 2020, people are emptying the shelves of anything staple, anything, all the ingredients for spaghetti bolognese, basically, pasta, meat, plus toilet paper, canned food, all of that stuff. And so that sent me back to find a report that had been done in 2013 after the Queensland floods about supply chain risk. And the government had this sitting in their bottom drawer, never done anything about it, that said there will be high risks around not just disasters, but multiple disasters increasingly. So the combination of, say, fire and flood, which we had at the beginning of 2020, the combination, Stephen Bartos, the author, literally names the combination of fire and pandemic.
Yeah.
So it was all written there before, 7 years before it happened. And so that risk chapter really, the idea of risk really stood out to me as a way of anchoring the first part of the book, because I think I had sort of envisaged that people might pick up the book and say, oh, it's only a book for foodies, or it's only a book for farmers.
Sure.
No, it's not a book for me, just, Mrs. Joe Blow on the streets, going to the supermarket. Suddenly everyone was confronted by empty shelves. We went close to running out of Australian rice because, and then the normal port of call is Vietnam, which is a big rice producer. Well, in the middle of the pandemic, Vietnam shut off its rice exports to keep them for its own people. We go into a spat with China. Yep. China, cuts off, puts big tariffs on barley, puts big tariffs on wine. So this China, this golden goose that farmers have been told, is going to bring home the bacon for them, suddenly is chopped off, and we have to find other markets. So all of these systems that we have been told, economic systems that we have been told are stable and pretty much immutable, is the way they've been described in my political lifetime, suddenly, were cracking, and there were legitimate questions. Now, I thought it was interesting that governments, when that sort of brief flurry of supply chain debate came up in the public eye after the shelves emptied, the government and the National Farmers Federation said, well, there's nothing to see here. We export, pretty much 60 to 70% of what we produce. There is no problem. But there are a lot of things that, the milk goes into a Tetra Pak. Australia doesn't make Tetra Pak. The tuna goes into a can. Australia doesn't really have very good canning facilities. All of these things that we've taken for granted, that we can just have this kind of comparative advantage, we've been told, only produce what you can do at the cheapest possible price, otherwise contract it out to some other country that can do it for cheaper. Well, we discovered, in a pandemic, that's maybe not such a good idea. So I'm not saying we should go back to a completely protected agriculture, or that the olden golden years were somehow, the good old days, and we should have a system like that. I'm just saying we've had this experiment for 30 years, of really competition policy that brackets has created less competition. Why don't we look at it again and reassess the way a business reassesses and says, is this working for us? The way a farmer might assess, oh, was that a good crop? Did it work well? What mistakes did I make? What grazing improvements can I make? Business people are always reassessing. Governments need to reassess too and say, in this new world where we've got this kind of US-China tension, we've got supply chain issues, is this the best way to go forward for the next 3 decades?
Absolutely, and I think you really you summed it up by, my take on it was that we worked out as Australian farmers that we need the little things from other places that we can't get when everything shuts down to produce the things that we do produce, which we're quite good at, to then send it to someone else to make it into the stuff that we buy it back as. And then some of those processes, though that's a generalisation, are broken, and it really shed the light on that. So, look, there's so much other to talk about. I wanted to dive into soil and culture and the relationship that people have to land. Tell me, what's the relationship, or what's the role here of the grazier? You know, one thing I did notice in the book is that you've got a lot of very switched on agricultural business entrepreneurs, and the various academics and boffins around them that are very, very good at what they do. The grazier didn't get such a front and center role there, and yet we have more of the land mass, the world's land mass, under grazing management than anything else. Where's the role of the grazier in all this for you?
I think the role of the grazier is really important because, as you say, you know, we have a relatively small amount of Australia is put down to crops, and even less irrigated. So the grazier has a massive role, and that was probably, even though we have sheep here outside my window, that was probably a sort of hole on my part. I think it sort of, I guess, compelled me to write the book in a way, is the whole kind of grazing conundrum. How is it that we manage these landscapes? You know, there's the idea that I know my Guardian colleague in the UK, George Monbiot, is always talking about, you know, we've got to get rid of these systems and we've got to go back to rewilding. Yep. Well, it just doesn't work in Australia. You know, we have fire feral weeds. So there has to be some sort of coming together of how we manage landscape in a way that doesn't expose us to more risk, sure, like fire ferals and weeds. And so I think the grazier has a really important role in managing that landscape. I've talked to people in all sorts of, I talked to so many people. Unfortunately, I couldn't squeeze them all into the book. But
well, look, you gilled Biberinga. You did. There were. I shouldn't say that you didn't, because you did. You had some fantastic graziers in there. It just was a smaller chunk. But look, you're absolutely right, and you did.
So, but yeah, but you know, like one of the guys I've spoken to is Angus White, and he's just north of Mildura, in between Mildura and Broken Hill. Yep. And I spoke to him for an essay that I did for the National Gallery of Victoria on this, and just that idea of how you manage landscape in a way that improves things rather than sends the environment into decline, I think is going to be a key issue for not just for farmers, but for government policy. You know, how those landscapes can be improved, I think is a really key question. And in fact, I think that will be part of the environmental services policy that we'll see in the next couple of years. And so the interesting thing to me for businesses like yours, Bart, is how graziers will explain this to the voting public, because they're going to be asked to vote on these programs. They're going to be asked by governments, you know, to assess policies that really lie at the heart of how graziers operate their businesses. And that, I think, is a really important question that we need to talk about. You know, it needs to be explained.
Absolutely. And look, you know, you've highlighted it in different ways, but essentially there's a story to be told. And yes, everyone's going to vote, and everyone will gravitate to the outcome that lands us where we need to land. But ultimately, we all need to have a story to tell, whether it's you on your farm, whether it's the corporate with their reporting, whether it's the policymakers, and that's part of our role, is that in our understanding of how this all evolves, is that the data helps tell the story, and that people can't just tell it anecdotally anymore, and that you know, we need to bring forward those disciplines from the Indigenous culture into how we manage data and how we manage what we do, so that there is a story to be told, so that we can chase the green lending, for example, and the certainty around risk, which is ultimately what we're talking about here and where you began the book. And there's so much in between. And I'm afraid, Gabby, that I could actually sit here for another couple of hours talking this through. And I think we're going to have to reconvene, because we've come to the end of our little window of time here, and I've still not even touched the sides of the detail here I wanted to get into with you. And there's going to be plenty of time for that. But all I can say is, folks, you must read this book. This isn't about.
Notice we have a question here. Have we got
yes, well,
a minute or two for a question?
Absolutely. Let me pull up the Q&A, because my time management is so fantastic that we are at the end, and I was imploring people to bring their questions through. So we'll get to those that we can. Gabby, from your research, how do you think the Australian farming community are going to navigate their way through the carbon market? Have we learned anything from trading water in Australia that may set us up for a positive future direction for the carbon and land stewardship? Or can you discuss your observations from one and only Jill?
Yes, thanks, Jill. Carbon market, I think, is really interesting and alarming to me, because I see the tribalism in farming that I see in politics now. There's been a real polarization, and whenever there's a discussion about carbon markets and proving, verifying carbon improvements, there's a bit of a pile-on from one side or the other. And I think, interestingly for me, it comes back to data. There's got to be clear verification. And I think that's, this isn't a setup, but I think products that provide that clear data are going to be more and more necessary, not only to the farmers in their business, but to outside sources who want to verify that the improvements that have been made have actually been made. There's something, even though economic modelling can be quite, challenging depending on what assumptions you put into that model, you can't argue with, say, a soil organic carbon number that can be tested and that everyone can see. And so I guess I have two things. One is that data piece that we're all going to have to plug into, whether you're scared of computers or not, whether you're scared of apps or not, we're all going to have to plug into it, because it will become a requirement. The other part of this, I think, is aggregators. And I'm just slightly worried that there is going to be a big opportunity for aggregators to translate how to deal with some of these complex questions that might be tempted to shave far too much commission off the farmer who has the risk, who has the assets, but maybe sometimes not the knowledge to implement them. So I think there has to be a balance between, the expertise that you get in the farmer who's putting up the risk and the assets, and then, the government regulation or oversight from maybe even it's a private organisation like a bank. Ken Henry talked about, these factors will be put into your farm loan now. Yep. They're going to be looking at your paddocks, not just for, the amount of livestock you're running, but banks will increasingly want to see you've got ground cover, you've got various things happening on the farm in a good way. And to just back to Gillian's question regarding the water market, I think the water market got away in a way that I don't think is overly helpful, in that, the person with the biggest pockets wins because they have access to the knowledge and resources. I think we need to find a way to create that diversity within the farming population so that, you can get access to resources. Also, it's up to farmers to want to pay for that stuff too. Like you pay for your shearing teams to come in or whatever it is. You pay for expertise all the time. You pay for very large bits of machinery. At some stage, you're going to have to pay for some expertise that knows this stuff, because you can't know everything as a farmer. You just can't. It's just way too complex a business. It's more complex than anything I've ever dealt with in journalism, probably. So, yeah, that's what I would say about learning from water and the carbon market.
Great question, great answer. And I think just to sum up there, it is a good example of the sum of all things here. We have got a big, complicated, interwoven subject, and ultimately it's incumbent on all of us to be able to tell our story. And that's ultimately what you're saying there, Gabby. And that is the challenge between, you know, surviving the changing marketplace, governments that are running to catch up to work out how this all works. And I guess I'll fall back to our own experience in terms of seeing people who have succeeded in this game in terms of natural value, as you describe it, natural capital, and eking out and identifying value streams in this regard. It really is about getting off your bum and producing and creating feedback loops that help you tell your story about your farm and your ecosystem and your relationship to it and everybody else. And there's a whole lot more to that we're going to go into another time, Gabby, that you've covered in your book. So I'd like to say thank you very much. We are at time. I could talk forever, but the reality is that we must pull it to a close. So Gabby, let me say thank you very much for a wonderful discourse and conversation and fantastic book. Congratulations on what you've achieved. I think there's a lot there for people to take on, and from either side of the political spectrum, from either side of the ecological spectrum, the eaters, the growers, and everyone in between. Well done and congratulations. And I'd like to thank the audience and my crew behind the scenes for organising everything here. And let's do this again. Hooray for Hollywood. It's now time for us to pull a drawbridge under us and to think about the big questions, to think about our role in all of the above, because that's what Gabby's ultimately challenging us to do here, right? We are obliged to care. That's ultimately what I took from you, Gabby, and that everybody has that same obligation, and the challenge is to have a common understanding of that and to engage. So that's our little chance at beginning that conversation, or perhaps continuing it for you, Gabby. So well done.
Thank you. Thanks, Bart. It was an absolute pleasure. It's so great to talk to someone that's steeped in it all.